A quiet room before dawn, screens dimmed to a low amber, notes aligned at the edge of my desk. I listen to the gentle breath of the fans and the softer breath you're finding now. We will keep the light low, we will keep the pace human. Tonight I'll guide you through a calm telling of an interstellar visitor and the way we learned to hear its chemistry without hurry. We'll start near the sun's bright edge, drift through the patient work of absorption lines, glance carefully at old mysteries that echo and settle into what our instruments actually know. No alarms here, no leaps, just light doing what light does. Before we set off, make this easy. Set your phone to Do Not Disturb. Dim the screen until the room feels like a soft dome. If headphones help, place them gently and let your shoulders fall a little. You're welcome to close your eyes. I will keep the thread. You may hear one instrument's name once, not to dazzle, only to anchor us. The MeerKAT array listening in a quiet desert. It is enough to know that careful ears were turned the right way at the right time. This is not about messages or shouts from the dark. It is about water's quiet signature and the way it appears when starlight touches ice. We travel by small steps. A pale ring of day-edge light will be our motif. When the story narrows, I'll widen it. When it expands, I'll bring it close again. If sleep arrives mid-sentence, the sky will keep. We begin now. Let your eyes land where mine begin. On a margin of light skimming the edge of morning, a pale ring laid thin across the horizon. I guide your gaze along it. Not straight at the sun, never straight at the sun, but just aside where glare loosens and detail returns. Metal surfaces wait in that gentler brightness, curved, quiet. Each dish carries its own faint sheen, as if a slow tide of day were washing over steel. We are not rushing. We let the light decide the pace. Move a little closer with me. The dish ribs catch a cooler tone, shadows braided between struts, cables resting in their places like lines drawn by a careful hand. Over the flats, a dozen more mirrors mirror each other, all tilted toward the same shy patch. The air is steady. The desert holds its breath. A listening posture has a look, and this is it. Now let the picture soften to stillness for a while. Distant insects making a small insistence. A low room hum that might be the imagination. Wind too far away to show its shape. Nothing urgent, only a long exhale tucked beneath the scene. We keep our gaze glancing near the sun's shoulder, where light is fierce, but not blinding. In that angle, the world looks simplified, as if the sky had pressed its palette into 2 or 3 gentle tones, so the mind can rest. Observing there is like reading near a window. You seat yourself just out of the beam, and the page becomes legible. The array follows that same courtesy. It listens where the noise thins just enough, where the pale ring of day-edge light asks for quiet and gets it. You and I do the same with ideas. We don't step into the blaze of speculation. We stand at its edge and let our eyes adjust. What we look for tonight is not a shout, but a subtraction. Not a lamp lit in the dark, but a thread of light lightly removed. Chemistry hides in such gentleness. When starlight brushes ice, a few notes fall out of the spectrum, and the absence becomes an answer. The dishes wait for that answer, patient as stones, patient as people learning to sleep. I show you how geometry lends a hand. When a wanderer moves at an angle, its motion nudges the light it affects to slightly different shades. easing it away from the sun's loudest clutter so a clear patch opens. Think of it as turning your head by a finger's width to hear a whisper better. The room hasn't changed, only your posture has. Astronomers call the posture by sterner names, but the feeling is the same. If the angle is kind, the sky becomes kinder, and in that courtesy a line can be heard. Time is the other partner. Windows open the way seas change. Not forever, not often, but long enough. Earlier, the ice might have been too cool to let go of its voice. Later, the object might slip behind the sun's broad shoulder and fall into radio noon, where all nuance is crushed. There is a narrow thread between those two, and this array is designed to walk it with soft feet. In the control room, no one leans forward with clenched hands. We lean back and let the instruments hold the thread, because steadiness, not strain, is how small things show themselves. And because the pale ring of day edge light is enough of a clock for work like this. Its slow advance reminding us that listening is a form of waiting. So we hold the gaze. We keep to the side of brightness and trace the curve of the dishes as they follow their appointed patch. Nothing dramatic announces itself. That is not the way of absorption. A quiet dip appears as a slight gentling in the graph, a hush shaped like a narrow valley, and the room answers with an equally narrow nod. It is not triumph. It is the relief of recognition, the sense that a familiar pattern has returned, not from here, but still familiar. The light, guided past the harshest part of day, resolves into something legible, and in that legibility we find enough to move on, enough to sleep on, enough to paint the rest of the night story with calm strokes as the ring thins from pearl toward blue, then dissolves into ordinary daylight. And now, while the image is still simple, the horizon, the dishes, the sun's shoulder, let it soften further. Let the tones blend until the ring is only a memory of brightness, a feeling on the eyelids more than a sight. The gaze can close, but the direction remains, and the color that held us becomes the color that carries us, from edge light to soft blue, to something quieter still. What does an absorption line sound like? It sounds like a pause that knows its place. Not a bang, not a bell, just a brief hush between notes where the music keeps flowing, and yet a sliver of quiet has been set aside. That small absence is the shape of information. It's how chemistry speaks without raising its voice. I picture it for you in sound, because sound carries the idea kindly. Imagine a sustained tone. Now imagine a two-note dip inside it, a softer moment within the longer breath. The tone continues, but a pair of gentle hollows appear, paired closely, as if a careful hand pressed two fingers lightly on a string. That is the outline of what we look for. Not flashing lights, not syllables. A soft two-note hush. So what exactly is quieting the tone? The answer is simple and patient. When starlight passes through a thin cloud around a small body, certain molecules sip specific colors out of that light. They don't add anything, they take a little away. The spectrum holds the record of that subtraction the way a score holds rests among notes. To read it, we do not chase the loudest part. We follow the hush. Now, let the room slow down with us for a minute. Air moves in the vents with even intention. A chair settles, wood remembering its own patience. Far away, some circuitry murmurs at a level most ears call silence. The page of night is turned with care, and nothing urgent is required of you. We hold the line and breathe. Two close rests in the tone often point to a single actor. The hydroxyl radical, born when water is nudged apart by energetic light, prefers to remove light at two neighbouring notes. That pairing is why so many spectra of heated comi carry a twin hush, as regular as breathing. It is a modest signature, and that modesty is part of its charm, because it lets us tell a clear story without asking the universe to shout. Water, warmed by a star, is not dramatic. It loosens. One hydrogen slips free and goes on its swift way. The remaining fragment lingers a little longer, and while it lingers, it is very good at taking those two notes out of the passing light. When enough of these fragments gather, the twin hush rises above the background like the suggestion of a chord, and we circle it gently in our minds. Comets in our own neighbourhood show the pattern when they wake. Drawn inward, they develop a thin, wide atmosphere, and in that envelope the same small physics repeats. The quiet becomes measurable. The graph dips at the right places. It is a familiar kind of beauty. Not fireworks, but a steady choir of tiny rests aligning into something you can trust. This is why comparisons help us sleep. We have heard similar music before. An interstellar visitor adds a second layer of wonder. The choir is the same, the hall is different. Ice from a distant system hums under our sun and leaves the same two soft hollows in the spectrum we've learned to read at home. That one, continuity. Water's tendency to break and whisper in the same way reassures the mind that natural laws stretch farther than any map we've drawn. We are not lost in novelty. We are hearing a known motif played on a borrowed instrument. Naming that instrument matters only to anchor the feeling that real metal once gathered the light, and real minds checked the printouts without dramatics. Arrays and single dishes share the task, but all of them agree on the rule. Chemistry is read most clearly when we do not impose a story on it. A line is a line. A dip is a dip. The rest belongs to interpretation, and interpretation should be slow. It is tempting to make music into a message. A narrow spike looks like a beacon, and the imagination leans forward. But a subtraction is not a broadcast. It carries no rhythm beyond thermodynamics, no cadence beyond the drift and jostle of gas. Beacons, when we search for them, are knife-thin and deliberate, chosen for efficiency, positioned with intent, and often kept near the most universal tones of the cosmos to make them easy to find. The quiet we are tracing tonight is not that. It is not a hand tapping back. It is the air in the hall briefly stilled when a known molecule passes by. Here is how I hold the distinction while I speak to you. A beacon, if ever found, will carry some structure that resists nature's usual turbulence. Repetition, spacing, modulation, a will to be noticed. An absorption pair from warmed ice carries structure too, but its structure matches the calm grammar of a laboratory. It is the difference between a whistle and a room tone touched by the closing of a door. One asks for attention. The other simply is. Across recent years, we've met more than one traveller and learned different lessons from each encounter. One arrived, surprised us, and left a debate about its push and shape. Another behaved like a tidy comet and let us measure comfortingly familiar things. Together, they tuned our ears. So when the twin hush appeared around material not born under our sun, we could set aside old arguments and simply listen for water's quiet proof. Long practice is good at reducing wonder to the right size, which, in this case, is not small at all, only calm. If you feel your breath lengthen as the chapter settles, that is the correct response. The science takes its time, because the sky takes its time. A pair of rests in a longer tone, a thin cloud around a small, brightening traveller. Starlight crossing that cloud and losing a touch of itself in a way we can measure and replicate. And beneath all of it, the steady lesson that nature repeats her softest answers across great distances, so that even late at night, even when the mind wants to wander toward grand explanations, we can return to the little hush and say, "This is water speaking, and we know how to hear it." That is enough for tonight. A postcard from another year lives tacked to the wall of memory. Late summer Ohio, a quiet control room, a long strip of paper fed from an honest machine. Someone leans in, traces a thin column of figures, and draws a small circle with a pencil. A single exclamation, private, human, turns the slip into a mile marker on the long road of listening. We keep passing that marker, and each time we slow a little as we go by. The telescope that night was all angles and patience, a wooden barn of a receiver tuned to one careful place where hydrogen most often speaks. The world outside slept. Inside, the instrument counted steadily, line after line of tidy characters, while the team did what all night watchers do, checked calibrations, sipped coffee, let the hours thicken into focus. When the paper cooled, a narrow spike stood up from the ordinary like a roadside sign noticed at the last second, and a note in the margin fixed it in time. Step out with me onto a warm August night behind the building. The air is slow, shaped by crickets that refuse to rush. A far highway murmurs, heat lightning breathes without sound beyond the tree line. Gravel holds the day's warmth, and the dark smells faintly of cut grass. Nothing asks for attention. The sky feels close enough to steady a hand on, and the only motion is the slow drift of your own breath. That old spike came from a direction that observers often favour, a busy stretch of sky toward the constellation of the Archer, where our galaxy's inner districts crowd the field. On maps, it looks like the thickening of a road, lanes merging, traffic dense with stars and gas. When we say near in such a neighbourhood, we mean what travellers mean. A familiar rest stop appears again along a long route, not the exact mile, but a segment you know by feel. A recurring mile marker. We note it, and we keep driving. Here is where we draw a firm handrail. A beacon is a chosen, narrow tone with a mind to be found. A chemistry dip is a subtraction that happens because molecules do what they must when light meets them. The hydrogen place on the dial is a useful landmark for beacon hunters because it is universal and quiet enough to carry a deliberate needle. The paired hush of a water fragment belongs to a different grammar, a different kind of road sign entirely. One juts upward in a thin, deliberate spike. The other curves downward in two close hollows, a trace left by warmed ice inhaling very specific colours, and then letting the rest pass on. Coincidence tries to sell us patterns whenever memory is strong. We remember the pencil circle and the place on the sky where curiosity flared, so when something new appears within the same broad district, the mind connects them as if the highway itself intended the rhyme. Yet crowded routes produce more sightings, simply because more travellers pass, and surveys return again and again to those stretches. So the odds lean toward familiarity without any deeper plan. We keep this in our pocket not to spoil wonder, but to keep it honest. the way a good map keeps scale in the corner so the legend can calm the imagination. After that earlier night, teams went back and back again, listening for a repeat that never arrived. That is its own kind of answer. A beacon worth the name would likely return or drift in season, allowing clocks and algorithms to find it again. A one-time spike belongs to the long list of maybes that teach patience, reminding us that the universe is allowed to be untidy, and that discipline means logging what didn't happen as faithfully as what did. When our present story hears a two-note hush around warmed ice, we apply that lesson, arrange follow-up, compare instruments, and accept that quiet can be truthful without being theatrical. So the old postcard stays on the wall for perspective. It marks a place on the listener's road where attention grew sharper, a milestone we pass on the way to newer work. We don't need it to predict anything. We need it to remember that curiosity has a history, and that the route from one night's spike to another night's absorption pair is not a shortcut, but a long drive over steady ground, where the scenery changes slowly and most rest stops give you nothing more mysterious than a safe place to breathe. And in the control room now, amber lights low. We let the reminder do its quiet job while we return to the calm habit of reading dips and notches at their face value, because that is how a long journey keeps its bearings, and how a wanderer's chemistry becomes a fact rather than a story. The clocks in here do not shout. They keep even time, a soft metronome under the hum. Screens hold to their lanes. A graph settles, the lines smoothing as the last jitters of the pass fall away. I write one line in the log with a steady hand and pause long enough to feel the night fold in at the edges. At 02:14, the room remembers how to breathe. If the angle is kind, the noise thins. If the current runs with you, the oars can rest. Tonight we sail along the sun's bright coast, not into its glare, but through a narrow channel where the swell is calmer and the instruments can keep their keel. A tide that turns once guides this passage. We watch for that slow turn and time our crossing. If motion brings a wanderer slightly toward us, or slightly away, then the colour of what we measure drifts by a small, useful amount. It is as if the sea shifted under the hull just enough to lift us over a hidden bar. The line we hope to read moves off the roughest surf from the sun and into a gentler run. No heroics are required, only a trimmed sail and a patient hand on the tiller. If the ice is still cold, then little lifts into the thin atmosphere around it. The water holds fast, the air stays clear, and our graph remains a level horizon. If the day's warm, then the surface loosens, and vapour begins to flow like a faint tide around stone, not rushing, only easing outward until it has volume enough to matter. Between those two states lies a moment worth the watch, a brief slack water when the chemistry is present and the sky is still navigable. Hold the chart with me and follow the coast. The sun throws radio spray in all directions, bright chop that drowns the small ripples we care about. Far from that coast, the ocean is quiet, but our traveller is also quiet, half asleep in the cold. Near the coast, the traveller wakes, but the surf rises. A narrow inlet lies between, wide enough for a careful passage, narrow enough that we have to sight along range markers and breathe with the tide. We time our run to the turn, a tide that turns once. If our view is skewed to the sun by just the right measure, then the roadway of noise opens a lane for us. Observers call it geometry, and give it neat terms for angle and speed. But you and I can keep the image simpler. The sailboat holds to a line where crosswind and tide cancel as if by courtesy. The mast stops creaking. The wake straightens. The helm lightens beneath your hands. Reading a dip in a spectrum feels just like that. You can sense when the water settles to let you through. If we are early by a week, the inlet has not yet filled. We sit off the mouth and wait, listening to the slap of small waves against the hull, knowing that patience is part of any honest crossing. If we are late by a day, the tide has already turned the other way and surf piles into the narrows. Instruments do not like white water, so we mark the tide tables, which in this work are ephemerides and elongations and phase angles written in tidy columns, and we trust them enough to raise anchor when numbers say go. All the while, the sun's music presses on the band we use, a bright roar that steals detail. If we take it head on, we lose the thread. If we keep to the shoulder, the roar drops and the small, steady signals show their shape. It is not a trick. It is seamanship. A good pilot does not fight the sea. A good pilot watches the timing at a bar and rides the quiet ridge between braking sets. Radio piloting is the same in spirit, even when the boat is a curve on a screen and the bar is a loud patch of spectrum. If the drift of the traveller shifts the line a hair's width, the way a river outflow modifies the colour of the sea, then we pick it out from the surf. If the outflow strengthens as sunlight climbs, then the colour darkens in the way we expect. Each if is small. Together they make a passage. No drama, just the confidence you get when wind, tide and helm line up for once, and the bow rises sweetly over the last of the chop. That's when the figures grow calm and the trace looks honest. We have missed these windows before. Everyone has. The inlet is narrow and storms of circumstance move quickly. A maintenance night falls on the only useful slot. The sky refuses to clear. The traveller slides behind the solar headland, where no keel can go and no ear can hear. Missing is part of the chart as surely as making it through. The log holds both, because a truthful chart sketches shoals and empty water alike, and because the lesson of a lost tide is the reason we catch the next one. If you are feeling your breathing find a longer cycle here, that is the right rhythm. This whole chapter is timing, the slow approach of warmth, the short slack when water loosens, and yet glare has not overwhelmed, the follow-through as instruments honour to their own tide table and make the crossing. All of it carried by the idea that a window does not argue its case with us. It simply opens and shuts on the schedule the sky keeps, which means our confidence comes not from boldness, but from a habit of arriving a little early, set in fenders, and hold in position until the gate lifts, because then the motion feels effortless, and the line we seek steps into the clear as naturally as a buoy lifting at turn of tide, steadying the hand that writes the time and the heading in the log. If the counts hold after the passage, then we know the channel was true. If a second look agrees, then the chart earns a small new mark in a corner that used to be blank. It's not much to see from a distance. But like any harbour that only opens at the top of the tide, it is everything when you need a safe entry, and it is enough to justify the watching we do along this bright coast, the way we study the small rises of the day to learn when to move and when to wait, the way we promise each other not to force the wheel in rough water and a trust calm when it arrives, because the graph settles most honestly when the helm is light, the tide is slack, and the inlet carries us with a slow, sure pull toward quieter water. And I like to set 3 handrails before we walk farther, 3 threads that hold the cloth in place so the rest can drape without tugging. The first thread is a messenger that arrived fast and quiet. It crossed the beam of a survey camera, its path not bound to our sun, its behavior tidy, until, on the way out, something gentle and persistent nudged it more than gravity should. The shape we pictured kept changing, as if the fabric resisted a firm seam. In the end, it left behind questions that still lie flat on the table. We fold that thread carefully and move on. The second thread came brighter and more familiar. A comet from elsewhere, but a comet all the same. Dust and gas made a soft shawl around it. The tail pulled with the sunward weave the way we expect, and instruments that specialize in ordinary coma did their ordinary, beautiful work. Water and carbon-bearing vapors rose, spectra lined up with classroom examples. The cloth of comet science felt strong in the hands. This time, the seam held straight, and we learned the comfort of repetition. The third thread is tonight's quiet reason for staying up. Not a spike and not a flare, but a pair of soft depressions in the radio cloth, where warmed fragments of water removed just enough light to be noticed. A traveller not born here, moving through our day, letting a thin atmosphere carry the small, specific behavior of a broken molecule. 2 close dips like twin stitches. Chemistry, not conversation. The fabric stays honest, and that honesty is soothing. Between those threads lies the loom of our methods. Optical surveys notice motion first because moving points stand out when the background is steady. That is how we find the strand in the larger weave. Then the work divides by wavelength. Optical spectrographs read reflected sunlight, telling us something about surfaces and dust. Ultraviolet eyes hear from fresh fragments and fast hydrogen, so they speak for water when it first parts. Radio arrays listen for molecules that prefer the long, easy waves, and they are patient enough to show us the 2-note hush we've been tracing. Each tool grips a different fiber. Together, they make a fabric strong enough to hold its own weight. Take a moment with me and let the room settle. The gentle roll of air from a vent, constant and forgettable. A faint transformer hum, as even as a hand on linen. Somewhere a chair leans back and returns, wood remembering its alignment. The screen glow is dim and warm, like cloth lit from beneath. This stillness is not empty. It's the weave, resting under light tension, ready to take another stitch when the fingers do. The mind can relax against it for a minute and feel how the pattern holds without strain. Those handrails offer lessons that matter more than novelty. The first shows how easily our models can snag on a loose thread when a body refuses to show the usual coma, and how a small, persistent acceleration can make us test the strength of our assumptions. The second shows how much relief there is in familiar fibers when an interstellar visitor behaves like a comet we already understand, letting cross-checked instruments tie knots we trust. The third shows that chemistry's grammar remains the same when the yarn comes from a distant mill. Water breaks, the fragment lingers, paired features appear. Across systems, the loom is the same. When we say water, we mean the clean curve of a molecule that likes to split into a light piece, and a piece that holds onto radio light in very specific ways. That fragment sets the 2 stitches we watch for. It helps us measure how much water is coming off, and with it, how active the surface has become under sunlight. This is the thread that holds most firmly, because it repeats everywhere we check. In comets near our sun, in jets we have flown past, and now in a traveller from another neighbourhood. The fabric of chemistry is remarkably consistent, and you can lay your cheek against that consistency. The way you press your face into a folded sweater, still warm from the line. There's another lesson stitched into the edge. Scarcity is often a matter of timing, not of occurrence. These visitors are faint and fast, and our surveys, however skillful, sometimes find them late in the pattern. The loom is already halfway through a row when we notice the new colour, and by the time we bring the right shuttle, the window has narrowed. A few nights can make the difference between a clean, deep measurement and a trace lost in glare. This is why cadence matters. It's why coordinated alerts, wide fields, and calm persistence are not luxuries, but tools for keeping the cloth even. If you listen closely, the habit of careful naming runs under every paragraph. We avoid hard claims about shapes we didn't resolve, and we keep our tone level when a traveller behaves in a way we expect. We do not promote a soft pair of dips into a declaration about voices from the dark, because that would pull the fabric off grain. A true beacon would have its own fabric, narrow, deliberate, and repeatable, and it would announce itself across time and instruments. What we have here belongs to a different shelf. The shelf labelled molecules doing the same thing under the same conditions. The shelf that makes rooms like this feel safe at night. So the handrails stand, a messenger with push. We still debate gently a comet that felt like home, and a new line in the cloth that reads as water touched by light. Around them, the looms are improving. Cameras sweep more sky. Spectrographs sit ready at more wavelengths. Radio dishes share their counts in time for partners to act. When the next thread appears, we will hold it with less strain. We will stitch sooner and stronger, and the cloth will fall cleaner over the frame, showing a pattern that is less about surprise and more about how different fibres keep showing the same strength when pulled. By now, the room has that late calm you recognize. Notes in a neat stack. A graph that looks like a well-made hem, straight, with only the intended dips. You can feel the weight of the fabric resting evenly on the table, not dragging, not twisting, just lying as it should. 3 threads keep it honest, and they are enough to carry us into quieter thinking, because they remind us that even when the pieces come from far away, the weave under our hands has not changed, and the threads that hold still hold. Begin close, so close you could count the frost grains if counting were restful. The surface holds a breath of ancient chill, a lace of rime lying quiet over darker crust. Under new light, the tiniest corners loosen first. Not a rush, not a boil. A hush around a stone as the skin of ice learns the day, and a few wayward molecules step away from the lattice like careful guests leaving early. What follows is simple and generous. Warmth seeps inward by shallow paths. Bindings relax. More guests rise. They do not pool or puddle. There is no room for that out here. So they lift straight to space, and in that lift, a veil begins. It is thin enough to see through and wide enough to matter, a mist that remembers the stone It left yet already belongs to the open. The old quiet is still present, only softer, because motion has been added to it. Let the room match that quiet for a minute, the even sigh of air through a vent, a distant, steady transformer murmur, low as fog on a morning field, the flutterless light of a monitor, warming nothing but your eyelids. Breath find in a slower lane and keep in it without instruction. The mind like ground glass, matte and cool, ready to show a shape without reflecting glare. Nothing new arrives, nothing is asked of you. The veil simply holds. Inside that veil, one fragment of the broken water lingers longer than its lighter sibling. The light one escapes freely, racing ahead into space until it is less a presence than a tendency. The heavier fragment is sociable in a different way. It mingles, drifts, and, for a while, that is long enough to be useful, chooses to remove two particular notes from passing light. It is a patient habit, this borrowing, and the habit makes the veil legible. As the mist widens, that double hush stays with it like a refrain. Widen a step. The veil becomes a coma, a low, round cloud wrapped close to the stone. It is not uniform. Warmth makes patches wake at different rates. Dust grains carry their own quiet stories of shape and charge. But taken as a whole, the cloud smooths itself into something we can treat kindly with averages. Its motions are small. Its temperatures are polite. And the spectral notches it writes are narrow, not because anything is razor sharp, but because the molecules share only a modest spread of speeds as they leave the surface, adding a fine, readable cleft in the line where chaos might otherwise have scrawled. We have watched such veils from closer seats. A spacecraft once paced a comet for years, tasting what rose, water foremost, then carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and many smaller flavors that speak of old chemistry baked into ice and dust. Jets stitched and unstitched the coma's hem as seasons turned on a lopsided world. Instruments that sniff and weigh confirmed what ground-based ears had long suspected, that when a small body warms, a family of volatiles answers in an orderly queue, and water is the member most often willing to stay present when the sun is near. This is why the two-note hush feels honest. It belongs to a pattern we have held in our hands. Why does water take the lead here? Partly because some cousins leave too soon. The most eager gases slip away over long, cold journeys, shrugging off the stone grain by grain until little remains at the skin to wake later. Water is more reserved. It keeps its place through darker years and doesn't ask to rise until the star's attention is firm. So when the day finally arrives, the veil it builds is mostly its own work, and the fragment that borrows those two precise tones has partners enough to be heard. An unhurried choir in a small, private chapel we only glimpse, yet recognize by its soft cadence. And in that recognition, the restless part of the mind sits down, because repetition across distance is one of the surest ways to quiet a room. Follow the veil outward. Density thins, and with it the likelihood that any single traveller will bump a neighbour. Still, the cloud holds together for a while, a lightly held congregation drifting from the stone. Here and there dust glints and settles, but the lightest children of the split run far, and fastest of all is the escaped hydrogen, already spread into a pale, nearly invisible bloom the sun will sweep and fold into its wind. The fragment we care about walks at a more human pace, long enough to leave its quiet marks in the spectrum before it, too, changes or moves on. And the line we see is a kind of footprint from that walk, not deep, not rare, only distinct enough to trace. Now the view is broad. The stone sits at the centre, like a punctuation mark softened by weather. The coma is a shawl of almost nothing, felt more than seen, its edge undefined, because edges are a luxury of crowded places, and this is not a crowded place. The mist grades into the larger dark, the way breath grades into air on a winter morning, quickly at first and then imperceptibly. And across that gradient, the same small grammar repeats. Fragments rise, borrow two notes, and drift. Dust takes up a slower drift of its own. Space remains mostly space, and the wonder is that we can read anything at all across such emptiness. That a hush around a stone can travel so cleanly to a dish on a far desert, and that our machines are quiet enough to hear it without mistaking their own noise for a signal of the world. If you tilt your head, you can imagine the veil's outermost reach where sunlight fades to a cooler idea, and the last of the borrowed tones give themselves back. Out there the mist is only memory. Nearer in, it is still action. Between is the comfort of a gradient. No cliff, no switch, just the slow unwinding of a small, repeatable event, one that happens on countless icy surfaces whenever warmth visits, and one that tonight lets us fold another page into a long, careful book without crinkling its corners, because we are not trying to hurry the end. We are letting the mist write its few lines and fade. And as the scale widens fully, stone, shawl, tail beginning to sketch, sun off to one side, the image holds steady in its quiet palette. The coma is almost not there. The fragment is already half legend. The hydrogen has gone to join larger winds. Only the trace on the screen remains, narrow and calm, like a fingertip drawn once through condensation on glass. The room is cool. The air is even. The hush around a stone keeps its shape a moment longer, then loosens like mist, and the picture fades with it. Listen first, before we label anything. A steady pressure whispers past the instruments, not a gust, but a presence. Charged particles carried outward from the sun, like air that never quite touches skin. In our headphones, it is nothing, and yet we imagine the field as a room-wide sigh, a baseline beneath everything else. Against that baseline, the comet lays its own texture, dust and gas giving the silence a grain. The ear translates eye work into tone so the mind can rest. A faint, sidelong hiss. That hiss points away from the light. It is the simplest habit in this part of space. Radiation pressure and the solar wind lean on the smallest pieces and push them outward, so that what your eye calls a tail behaves like a breeze mark on water, streaming from the traveller's far side and thinning into distance. The effect is patient and cumulative. No drama is required. Dust that left earlier always rides farther downwind. Fresh dust sits closer in, and the gradient reads like a long, soft exhale. Then you see a contrary trace and sit a little straighter. A second streak seems to lean the wrong way, toward the sun rather than away. It looks like disobedience, like a violin string bowed from the wrong end, and the imagination wants to call it a message. But geometry is good at practical jokes. When Earth crosses the traveller's orbital plane, perspective can gather older dust into a thin, sharp line that appears sunward, even though every grain still obeys the same quiet physics. And what looks like defiance is only the view compressing depth into a single bright thread. It is still the same faint, sidelong hiss. We're just standing where echoes play tricks. Jets add a second texture to the sound. A comet is not a uniform kettle. It wakes in patches, and those patches vent along cracks and pits pointed in whatever direction the small body's spin happens to offer. One hemisphere may meet morning, while the other is still in a long polar night. A warm hollow can build pressure and release it as a narrow plume that fans into curves as it leaves the neighborhood of the nucleus. As the body turns, the jet leans, and the broad tail sways by degrees you can feel in the data. Rotation turns the hiss into a slow, sidelong whisper with a wobble in it, like air moving past a loose reed. Brightness is no more consistent than breath. Dust production rises and falls with sunlight, with rotation, with glancing fractures that briefly open deeper layers. Phase angle, the angle between sun, comet, and observer, adds its own gentle bias by changing how forward scattered light favors the eye. Over days, the total light can ease up or down without a single outburst, and the graph looks like a tide mixed with a heartbeat. We learn not to lean on any one point. We learn to listen for the shape of changes rather than the spike of an event. Models help us name these patterns. They fold rotation states, heating, and grain sizes into pictures that match the broad strokes we see. They account for the slow drift in path that an uneven outflow can impose, a small, steady nudge that makes a trajectory look slightly off if you expect only gravity. And when the inputs are kind and the data are patient, the match is good enough to sleep on. And yet, even when the fit is close, there is always a little leftover murmur the model doesn't swallow. A gentle remainder that reminds us these are lumpy, ancient things, with histories etched into their crusts, and that any simple description of dust, gas, spin, sunlight, and time will leave some whisper unclaimed. Return to the tail and the anti-tail with this calmer ear. The main flow remains an outward hush. The sunward filament keeps its plane trick dignity, a line assembled by perspective from dust shed earlier along the orbit. Jets ride on top as slight warbles. Day by day the pattern changes in ways that feel musical rather than mechanical, modulation rather than a switch. If a brightness lift arrives, we ask first whether geometry or rotation could have tuned it. If a kink appears, we look for a jet. The checklist is simple, and it keeps the mind from telling hurried stories. We could turn this into a case, but we don't. The data are more modest and more interesting than a verdict. A traveller shows two streams that seem to disagree until you stand in the right place and see they are old companions. The brightness does not hold still, and neither does our line on the page, but both wander within the bounds that physics has been sketching for decades, and the relief that brings is the kind that raises no voice. The kind that lets the eyelids fall a little lower while the graph continues to write. A faint, sidelong hiss. Let the instruments be the room for a minute. Imagine their fans whirring low and constant, cable jackets making small sounds against metal, a power supply breathing evenly, the faraway shuffle of night staff closing a door. And beneath those human noises a larger quiet, made of distance and dust, of wind that is not wind and light that becomes a way to hear. Hold that still bed of sound as a single, slow minute passes, without your attention having to do anything to keep it true. A low hush settles between instruments, a slow breathing of metal and night. The instrument keeps time. Integration, settle, integration, settle. I let my thoughts fall into that rhythm until each new spectrum feels like a stitch laid into cloth. A gentle pull in the weave steadies the hand. The counters advance, and the screen redraws with the same decorum a loom shows when the shuttle returns. Nothing flashes, nothing shouts. The device prefers small certainties, and I take its side. Counts become a line. The line carries a dip. The dip holds its place across successive frames. I listen to velocity the way a tailor listens to thread, feeling for tension that doesn't belong. Light shifted by motion tells us how quickly the gas drifts. Light pinned by rest tells us when the background is calm. If the center of the feature wanders just so, we translate that drift into speed. Along our sightline, and the numbers on the log become a record of a traveler's breath, in and out, measured in small, faithful exhalations. Not every nudge in a path is gravity's work. When sunlit faces warm, they vent. And when vents are uneven, thrust is uneven too. A small body, mottled by history, releases gas more from some facets than others, and every molecule that leaves pushes back a little. Over hours and days, those pushes add up to a slow bias, the way a hand that pulls a little harder on one warp thread can ease the pattern sideways without tearing it. The orbit solutions accommodate this with quiet parameters that stand for a bit of thrust here, a bit of thrust there, a standard patch sewn into a standard seam so the cloth lays flat again. I keep the instrument's cadence as I think through the part of the orbit where any tiny push would matter most. Deeper in, speed is higher, and small changes in momentum go farther. A stitch taken near the edge can tug a whole hem, but a stitch taken at the fold carries wider. The mathematics say the same thing more precisely, although tonight's work doesn't need the full diagram. I hold the idea gently. Near closest approach, little deltas are leveraged, and far from it, they are not. In both cases, it is still fabric, and we grant no intent to a seam that simply follows the lay of the cloth. Data like ours earns its confidence by fit, not by flourish. We write a model that assumes no engines, only sunlight, spin, geometry, and outgassing, and we ask it to meet the line on the page. Often it does, not perfectly, but close enough that the leftover is smaller than the patience of our instrument can distinguish. The same practice has explained path quirks for many comets before tonight, and spacecraft that flew beside one for years watch the thrust of jets shift the little world beneath them by just the amounts the old models anticipated. When line and model disagree by more than temperament allows, we do not leap. We retune the weave, check the tension again, and look for a broken thread. If ever there were more than outgassing at work, the pattern would betray it. Not by spectacle, but by stubborn regularities that nature doesn't keep. Thrust that turns on and off with a schedule, instead of with sunlight. Accelerations that point against the spin illumination logic. Sudden, repeated velocity steps without corresponding changes in brightness or line shape. Sidebands or modulations tucked into spectral features that have no business carrying them. None of those live in our trace tonight. The lines are plain. The drift is mild. The counts behave as they should when a warm patch breathes and a cooler patch holds, and the orbit responds as fabric does to a biased pull, slightly, predictably, and with a memory of where the tug began. The device clicks at the end of each scan, and I find that sound reassuring. a bobbin's end note that signals the row is done. Between ticks, I think about what it would take to accuse a path of steering, and the answer is more than one clever graph. It would take multiple instruments agreeing across days. It would take correlations that survive changes in viewing angle. It would take features that persist when solar energy does not support them. It would take a refusal in the data to be explained by the old, tested ways. In short, it would take a pattern that pulls against the weave so decisively that the cloth cannot be laid flat by ordinary adjustment. That is a high bar, intentionally high, because the universe gets the benefit of the doubt when its familiar habits are enough. The spectrometer has its own habits too, and we mind them. Calibrations keep the thread true, so velocity centers that drift with intolerance do not seduce us into seeing maneuvers where there are only thermostats and texture. Line widths that broaden and narrow with temperature and turbulence are expected. Widths that jitter in lockstep with a clock we did not set would not be. Intensities that swell with sunlight and shrink with shadow are the rule. Intensities that march to another drum would ask for attention. These are the tests we apply, each small by itself, together, strong, like reinforcing stitches that hold a cuff through years of wear. Sometimes a model's residuals invite the imagination to picture something engineered. I let that invitation pass quietly tonight. There is no virtue in pretending the cloth is torn when it is only wrinkled from being folded too long. The jet-in picture strands rotation, illumination, and geology into a pattern that is messy but knowable. If one face has pockets of more volatile ice and another carries crust, thrust will favor the first until seasons change. If the rotation axis leans, morning vents wake differently from afternoon vents, and the net push wobbles. Our fits accept all of this without poems, and while they never capture every ripple, they keep the main lay true. What I want you to feel in this room is the way modest evidence settles the heart. The device who speaks in counts has no appetite for stories. It prefers the quiet victory of a line that repeats when it should and shifts when it must. With that as anchor, we can separate conjecture from cloth. We name the gentle pull for what it is, outgassing that refuses to be perfectly balanced, and we leave the rest for another night, another target, another set of rows woven under another star. The weave holds. The hand relaxes, the screen refreshes on cue, the spectrograph ticks once. I follow a colour through the room the way a walker follows a line of paint across a quiet floor. On our screens, hydrogen's landmark is often drawn in a calm, deep red, a familiar beacon lane that engineers choose so the eye won't lose it in the noise, while water's broken fragment traces as a thin green thread, two gentle hollows paired beneath that thread like stitches you can feel with a fingertip. The palette is ours, not the sky's, yet the habit helps. Red for the old universal landmark, green for the modest chemistry we're reading tonight. That choice of colours reminds me to keep the distinctions intact. Beacons, the deliberate kind we've spent decades hunting, prefer a narrow razor tone placed where any physics student would look first, a single spike chosen to be unmistakable against nature's usual clutter. Chemistry is less theatrical. It takes away rather than adds, dipping the spectrum at specific notes because molecules have their manners, and the pair we follow rests close together along that green trace like the quiet of two breaths. One asks to be found, the other allows itself to be seen. There's another kind of signal we've learned to respect, the kind that no one intends to send. A world with transmitters leaks a fog of radio the way a town leaks light at night, and technology leaves fingerprints even when the hand is turned away. Exhausts, waste heat, unexpected molecular ratios, timing patterns that follow engines rather than seasons. These are not messages in the human sense, but they are expressions of work. And work is easy to overhear if you know how to listen. We test for such fingerprints with patience and good bookkeeping rather than appetite. Chemistry is the best ledger we own. Molecules form a temperament chart, not just which species are present, but how much, in what proportion, and how they vary with warmth, spin, and view. A ratio out of place is an accent you notice in a familiar language, a change that repeats on a clock. No sunlight keeps begins to look like a factory schedule. You still do not leap to conclusions. You widen the spectrum, you cross-check with other eyes, you look for siblings of the same family that should appear if the oddity is genuine. And when the pattern keeps returning with its same polite angles, it earns another line in the book. The thin green thread we're tracing sits where our instrument is strongest. This array likes the long, easy waves, the band where the air thins of human chatter in a protected desert, and dishes can add their listens together until whisper becomes contour. 64 mirrors turn one ear, many into one, and a correlator sifts the chaos until it resembles a sheet laid smooth on a bed. The method rewards calm. It is happiest when the environment is quiet and the rules are ordinary, because ordinary rules, obeyed, are what make small deviations meaningful. Let the room breathe for a minute. Fans keep a low, even promise. A power strip ticks once as it remembers to do nothing else. Somewhere down the corridor, a kettle concludes its small errand and cools without comment. Chair fabric remembers the last person to lean back, then forgets. The cursor drifts and returns to its mark. Night is a color without edges, the kind you wear when you want your thoughts to move slowly. And the instruments respect the dress code. When we want a second opinion, we don't change the picture. We add more eyes. A single enormous dish that hears faint sounds with effortless grace. Another that dwarfs even that, listening so well that the earth has to ask it to speak softly. An array of many dishes arranged in sweeping, geometric patience. Each hears differently. One excels at pure sensitivity, another at resolving shape, another at mapping extended haze without losing the core. If a feature belongs to the sky, it will live in each ear according to that ear's strengths, shifting only by the geometry we compute in advance. If it belongs to us, to our cabling or our habits or a passing artifact, it will refuse to obey that choreography, and we will invite it to leave. And because this choreography spans days and angles and receivers built by different minds, when it holds, it does more than reassure. It slows the pulse in the room in a way that reminds you why you chose night work at all. Because a repeated, honest pattern is a kindness the world sometimes grants us when we've been patient with it. We belong, in other words, to a method that prefers converging evidence to clever anecdotes. A candidate that rides with the target as it crosses the sky, that shifts by just the velocities the ephemeris predicts, that disappears when the beam is moved aside, that reappears when another instrument takes the watch. Such a candidate earns the right to be called real, and only then do we examine whether its realism is entirely natural or quietly flavoured by something else. The something else will not announce itself with fireworks. It will show through in regularities that nature doesn't favour, in correlations that ignore sunlight, in byproducts that suggest sustained, directional work. Until then, we keep to the thin green line and its neat, paired rests. Sometimes the temptation is to call any unusual ratio a whisper from minds we haven't met. This room has seen that idea arrive with urgency and leave with relief. An oddity that melts under better calibration is a tonic. An anomaly that vanishes when the weather steadies is a good teacher. A claim that survives replication is a rarity worth the careful words we save for such occasions. And even then, our tone does not change much because the road is long, and exuberance isn't a tool. The tools are spectra, ephemerides, cross-checks, and a record of having said not yet, often enough to make perhaps feel responsible when it finally comes. If you've made it this far with your shoulders a little lower and your breath a little longer, you're listening correctly. The thin green trace will still be here after sleep. We'll keep it company, one quiet pass at a time, while you let the rest of the room dim and fall behind you. I'll be here with the small lights, and when the next honest pattern arrives, I'll tell you plainly what it looks like and what it doesn't. You can let your shoulders drop here, the sky does too. Let's take the slow path and feel the ground. Each step has its own small sound, and the road is even enough that the mind can idle. A steady path underfoot. On either side, familiar landmarks pass at walking speed. Water traced in disks around young stars. Water in the air of planets that rush around suns we will never visit. Water in the jets of comets that arc in from cold storage. We keep moving, and the pattern stays the same. Wherever light is allowed to tell its story well, it keeps mentioning the same simple molecule. Not only water, of course. There are carbon chains that turn up on stony messengers that fall through our own sky. There are sugars and acids and aromatic rings caught in the black varnish of some meteorites. Chemistry that looks like someone forgot a primordial pantry on the doorstep. Space does not seem stingy with ingredients. It sprinkles them the way a baker dusts a board before kneading. The walk is long, but the scenery repeats in a way that comforts. Ice, rock, organics, sunlight, and the long patience of time. Hands stay at our sides as we pass the part of the lane where grand claims like to set up their stalls. The presence of ingredients is not the same as the presence of a recipe carried out, and the presence of a recipe is not the same as dinner on the table. Our measurements remain chemical, not biological. In a spectrum, we hear molecules, not metabolism. In a radio dip, we hear fragments, not cells. The restraint is not a loss. It's the way a careful walk avoids false doors. If we slow further, we can point to signs along the trail without lifting the voice. Some telescopes make out water vapor on distant worlds by watching starlight filter through their skies. Others map chilly rings around new suns and find water ice as part of the dust and rubble that will, someday, be planets. Closer to home, spacecraft flew through a tenuous plume and found salty water vapor around a moon with an ocean inside, and years before that, small stones in a museum drawer told us, once instruments learned how to ask, that their pores sheltered complex organics for longer than any human story. None of these are shouts. They are trail marks scratched into posts. Here is water. Here are carbon companions. here is energy passing through. You may be thinking of the old idea with the old name, the one that says seeds drift. It has many versions, and the gentlest, most conservative one is all we need tonight. Chemistry travels. It travels on dust with ice mantles through dark clouds. It travels inside comets that war, swim and shed. It travels in meteorites that survive a fall and arrive with their carbon skeletons intact. In laboratories on Earth, cold ices blasted by light will assemble some of those same skeletons, which suggests the universe is not waiting for special tricks. It is content with repetition, temperature, and patience, and with many tries across long time. That is a walkable thought. Step after step, we keep the scale in view. A galaxy is wide. Civilizations, if they arise, are brief compared with the orbits of stars around the center. Two travelers could set out along the same ridge and never meet if one starts a little earlier and ends a little sooner. So the quiet you and I notice, the silence where we expected to hear town bells from the next valley, may be the silence of schedules that do not overlap, or of voices that do not choose to shout into the dark, or of messages that take paths we are not sensitive to yet. The slow walk protects us from turning that quiet into despair. It asks a simpler question. What do we actually hear, and how often does it repeat? Along this road, negative answers are not empty. They are paving. A spike that never returns forces our methods to mature. A popular hypothesis that dissolves under a cleaner calibration reminds us why cleanliness matters. An hour of listening that yields only room tone and the regular pulse of our own equipment still teaches something about our thresholds. The night is long. Most minutes are routine. But the routine is the net that holds the rare fish when it finally arrives, and the habit of writing "not this time" is the handrail that keeps us from running downhill when a shadow looks like a door. Crossing a small footbridge, we look back at the rooms we've walked through in this telling. A near-sun geometry that opened a window. A patient pair of dips that spoke in water's grammar. Tails that looked contrary until perspective explained them. Velocity nudges that needed only warm jets to account for their manners. Each room furnished with the same modest furniture, spectra, timing, alignment, replication. There is pleasure in seeing the pieces recur, like stones set at regular steps up a garden slope, and there is peace in knowing nothing demanded a flourish to be understood. Keep the pace gentle. On hills of origin and destiny, the view is excellent, but the footing is loose. We can say with comfort that ingredients travel and reassemble under simple rules, that star systems form with water frozen into their outskirts, that light and time encourage carbon to make complicated shapes, and that fragments of both water and carbon arrive on worlds that sit in the band where liquid water can pool. We cannot, from a paired hush in a radio band, climb to statements about neighbours. We cannot, from a plume rich in organics, step directly to kitchens or cities. We can stay on the path, though, and feel how wide it is, and notice how often the same stones appear underfoot. There's a particular kindness in this pace. It lets us admire negative spaces, where no line appears, where a beacon fails to repeat, where a suspected modulation turns out to be the weather. By the time a pattern remains after such attrition, it's no longer a novelty. It's a fact with edges worn smooth by handling, ready to rest in the pocket of anyone who passes and has need of a touchstone. And if, someday, a pattern arrives with the stubborn regularities that only intent can sustain. It will not have to fight our appetite to be believed. It will simply pass the same tests every quiet candidate took before it, and then we will change our verbs. On we go, and the ground stays steady. A steady path underfoot. Your breath has probably found a slower lane by now, one that fits the grade and the hour. The story carries in the same way a lantern does when you do not swing your arm. Light resting on a circle of ground, edges soft, no hurry to reach the gate. Ahead, a doorway stands in the dark field. We can make out its frame and the place where the lintel meets the night. We do not step through. We pause, set a hand on the wood, and feel it take the temperature of our palm. This part is a letter to you, folded small and left beside your pillow. You and I have been sailing the bright coast for a while, tracing wake lines and reading water. Near our ship, just astern and off the beam, the current sometimes gathers into a quiet eddy, close enough to notice, far enough that we never quite touch it. Earth has companions like that. Not moons in the strict sense, but stones that share our pace around the sun, and, from our deck, seem to loop with us for a season, or for many. I want to tell you about them softly, because their nearness invites storytelling, and softness helps us choose the right stories. They are called quasi-satellites, and the name is honest. They do not orbit Earth the way the moon does. They orbit the sun as we do, keeping roughly the same period, matching our long tack so neatly that when you plot their path from our moving ship, their loop looks like a gentle dance around us. Picture two boats in the same wide current, each steering its own line, but one keeping station off the other's quarter. From shore, it looks like escort. From the waterline, it is shared flow, a quiet eddy near our wake. On the chart, their loops are more than pretty. They teach patience and perspective. In the three-body pull of sun, earth, and stone, these companions trace Lycidas-like figures when seen in our frame, coming ahead, falling behind, drifting above and below the ecliptic, as if they were testing the limits of a mooring that never quite goes tight. Some linger for decades, some for centuries, then a small shove from another planet's distant tide, or a slow trade with Earth's gravity, eases them out of the eddy and back into a freer stream. We annotate the chart, knowing that every safe anchorage here is temporary, every station keeping choreographed by mathematics kinder than it looks. Pause with me and listen to the harbour at night, a hush of air slipping under the door, the soft tick of a wall clock choosing not to hurry, a far hallway's footfall passing and fading, your own breath rising to the gunwale and falling again, a kettle's last murmur resolving into quiet metal. No new facts arrive, no logbook needs an entry. It is enough, for a minute, to feel how a small eddy steadies a larger flow, and how nearness can be a comfort without demanding a name more grand than companion. Because they loiter, these companions spark bright ideas and require calm ones. They would make tidy observation posts in fiction, long lines of sight, changing angles on our weather, a vantage that keeps watch without crowding the hull. But when the mind leans too far over that rail, the sea will remind it to sit back. Our task is simpler and more beautiful. Watch the loops, learn the cadence, keep the geometry straight. Nothing in their patience asks for drama. The eddy forms because the current and our motion agree for a while. The rest is a sailor's restraint. Eyes up, hands easy on the wheel. How do we learn who these companions are? The same way we learn any stone at sea. We watch how they brighten and dim as they turn, light curves telling us how quickly they spin and whether their hulls are smooth or battered. We measure colours and reflectance with spectrographs, comparing the way they return sunlight to the fingerprints of silicates, metal, and glassy debris. One well-watched companion even hints at a kinship with lunar rock, its spectrum leaning toward the powder and glass of old impacts. The notion is not a verdict, only a correspondence, but it shows how a careful eye can tell sandbar from reef without climbing down the ladder, and that is a kind of magic earned by patient optics. We range them by distance without turning them into mascots. Many moon lengths away, they keep to lanes that are safe for instruments and quiet for nerves. Radar sometimes reaches, painting a few facets with a brief, bright ping. Most nights we rely on reflected sunlight alone, treating small variations with the same gentle skepticism we've practiced everywhere else in this voyage. If a colour shifts with air unsteady above the telescope, we wait for steadier air. If a period doubles under a thin moon, we check the cadence again on fuller nights. Sailors trust repeats more than gusts. Astronomers do too. Survey ships and shore stations make this work possible. Wide-field cameras sweep for move-in points, promoting the quick ones to a watch list. Follow-up telescopes refine their tracks until the loops draw themselves with confidence. A year of attention becomes 2, becomes 10, and the eddy's shape sharpens in the log. Each return of the season brings the companion back to its station with just enough difference to remind us the current has moods, and just enough sameness to make the navigator's heart ease. And while they circle in shared time, they nudge questions we can hold, and questions we can let drift by. Hold. How long will this one linger? What resonance keeps its company so neatly? Do its colours match familiar shores or strange ones? Drift. What might hide there? Who might be watching? The first set brings better ephemerides, spectra, and maps. The second tempts the pulse to quicken without giving the hands anything useful to do. We let the second pass. The first keeps us honest, and honesty is the only ballast that quiet seas require, because even on calm nights, instruments can mistake their own hum for wind if we forget to listen correctly. You may feel, as I do when these loops play across the screen, that their patience changes the scale of the night. We've been following a bright coast, near-sun passages, narrow inlets of time, quick turns at tidal gates. And here is an eddy that keeps pace for years, a soft circle near our track that invites the longer view. And that longer view, carried in a single unbroken thought, from one observing season into the next, without any fussy urgency, makes sleep easier, because it reassures us that not every important thing happens quickly or at the edge of glare, and that the quiet companions of our wake can teach us as much about timing and trust as any stormy passage we have already survived. So I leave the letter here for you, folded once and weighted with a pencil on the chart table. It says only this: we aren't alone in our path around the sun, though we are singular in our needs. We share the current with small, temporary neighbours whose presence asks for care rather than ceremony, and our instruments know how to greet them, by watching steadily, measuring gently, and letting time perform the introductions that haste always fumbles. What else lingers just beyond the lantern circle, keeping our pace without coming aboard? Night shift labs have their own weather, The air is cool and dry. Screens radiate a low tide of colour. The clocks choose not to hurry. 2 mugs live by the console like small moons, one warming the hand, one collecting the light from the rack LEDs. Everywhere, quiet competence, a login that never fails, a script that has learned to wait its turn, a spectrograph that prefers regular meals. We keep the voices low because the room already knows what to do. On one wall, a feed of move-in points glides in from the wide field surveys, each dot a small errand crossing the night. Some are meteors and will be gone by the next refresh. Some are ordinary near-Earth stones. A few get promoted to a brighter line in the queue because their paths lean away from the sun's embrace and refuse to close, and that geometry asks us to look longer. The pipeline does not celebrate. It forwards coordinates and times. The lab nods and begins to aim. Across the hall, a different rhythm plays. A multi-object spectrograph settles its 1,000+ fibers onto a star field with the neatness of a tailor pinning a large pattern to cloth. Its task is not a single comet, but a catalogue, a slow, metropolitan sweep of chemistry, silicates and metals in asteroids, gases, in glowing regions, the subtle tints that reveal where elements have wandered since their birth in stars. A survey night for that instrument feels like weaving, thread after thread, spectrum after spectrum, until the panel on the monitor fills with orderly colour. Beside it, our radio gear keeps to longer waves and smaller ambitions. It listens in one place, then another. Integrates, checks itself, integrates again. When a candidate pops out of the optical feed, a small script wakes and writes the pointing list in our syntax, translating the sky's address into the dish's language. The handwritten log remains on the desk anyway, a human margin where one of us will still write clear, thin cirrus, good wind, the way sailors mark slack water on a tideboard, even when the chart has already told them so. Let the lab's weather fill the minute. Fans keep their steady promise, cable trays carry a hint of warm dust, a lift far away opens, pauses, and closes. A kettle finishes its thought and becomes metal again. Shoes whisper on the corridor's painted concrete. The night feels drafted rather than poured, as if the building itself were a careful diagram. Nothing asks for speed. The work advances by the quiet meter of scheduled exposures and routine cross-checks, and the mind takes the hint, deciding to be useful by being unhurried. This is the shape of modern listening, a chain of places that agree to pass notes without vanity. One survey camera notices motion and raises a flag. An alert broker relays the message to subscribers who have learned to wake gently. A radio array nods and makes room in its plan. A different optical instrument, the one with the many hands, adds the traveller to its list if brightness favours it. The next morning, an infrared eye looks for heat. None of this is drama. It is choreography. And the point of choreography is not to impress the dancer, but to make the step inevitable. We talk sometimes about how the era is changing. Early work depended on luck. A wanderer found late a window that opened by kindness, a half-dozen instruments that could spare an hour. Now the nets are being hung high and wide. The camera that will map the sky every few nights is finishing its rehearsals. Its 3.2 gigapixel gaze will flood the alert stream with moving errata, and, tucked among them, with real visitors flagged while they are still far out, faint but known. The spectrograph with its 2,000-odd fibers will go on stitching the larger quilt, ready to peel off a minute here and there for a comet's dust or a newly noticed asteroid's sheen. The radio dishes will keep the long vigil that makes a pair of narrow dips climb out of noise. The difference is not new technology for its own sake. It is time. Time before perihelion. Time before glare. Time enough to replace lucky snapshots with planned listening. Under the graphs, we keep the same discipline. When a candidate appears, we write down the expected Doppler drift and then check that the line follows it. We point off target to confirm that the feature walks with the sky and not with the cables. We compare one instrument's hearing with another's. We let repetition train us to see small differences as edges, not as headlines. And we accept that the overwhelming majority of alerts are good practice for the handful that matter, because this is how nets are made, by spanning too much on purpose so the rare thread is caught without fuss. The lab does not isolate, it belongs to a neighborhood. South of here, a desert array listens under a protected silence. North, a single dish hears whispers that would never reach our floor. West, an interferometer spreads its arms and resolves haze into shape. Across an ocean, a fiber machine parks its pins on a new field. The idea is not that any one of them is perfect, but that together they make it harder for a coincidence to pretend to be a fact, and easier for a fact to become a result, and then a habit, and then a quiet sentence we can keep repeating until everyone knows it by heart. There is a long sentence I write for myself, sometimes near the end of a shift, that our tools are trying to teach us to replace appetite with method, to let the calendar bear some of the weight, to move our attention from single nights to seasons, from events to populations, from single spectra to atlases, and that when we do, the room grows calmer, not because the universe has become less strange, but because strangeness that repeats becomes a curriculum, and curriculums are the kind of strangeness a tired brain can sleep beside without having to hold the entire sky in its hands. Look around the lab once more before we dim. Status bars advance with winter's patience. The queue trims itself without complaint. A few green LEDs offer their small consent, and a blue progress band slides from left to right with the assurance of a tide on a beach no one has yet walked. The building takes a deeper breath. The colours lower themselves by a notch, and the night resolves toward morning in a way our instruments understand, which is to say politely, and in order, and with more data than we had when we began. The green thins toward a pale blue, almost a lullaby. Thank you for keeping me company through this quiet watch. We stayed near the sun's shoulder, where glare thins just enough for careful ears. In that narrow lane, dishes in a desert heard chemistry as subtraction, a paired hush from water's fragment resting in a thin coma. Not a beacon, not a shout, only molecules keeping their manners. We walked past older mile markers too, a summer spike that never returned, a swift visitor that left with a puzzling nudge, another that behaved like a textbook comet. Together, they gave us context, so tonight's calm lines could be held without hurry. Tales streamed the way physics prefers, and a sunward filament resolved. As perspective, a neat trick of plane and dust. Small thrusts from uneven warmth were enough to tilt a path by gentle degrees. Instruments shared the load. Optical eyes marked motion. Ultraviolet ears traced fresh fragments. Radio arrays kept the long listen. Surveys and brokers passed notes, and other observatories nodded in reply. A new era of nets and schedules is turning luck into planning, giving us more time before glare and more chances to repeat what matters. Closer to home, patient companions looped through Earth's frame, coasting in shared time like quiet eddies near our wake. They asked for steadiness more than stories, and the same was true everywhere we looked. The lesson kept returning. When the universe is willing to whisper, we answer with method. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. The graphs will keep their places. The thin green trace will wait for morning, and the desert will still be listening. You did enough by breathing with the cadence and letting the room be simple. Thank you for the trust and for the quiet. Sleep comes easily when patterns hold. Good night.